October 1944. Leyte, the Philippines. The air is a thick, suffocating curtain of humidity, carrying the metallic tang of blood and the heavy, sweet rot of the tropical jungle. Beneath the jagged canopy of palm fronds, the mud is a primordial sludge, clinging to the leather of boots and the hems of stained cotton uniforms. In a makeshift field hospital carved into the earth, the dim light of flickering oil lamps casts long, dancing shadows against the walls of dirt. Here, the silence is not peaceful. It is a pressurized void, punctuated only by the shallow, ragged breathing of the dying and the distant rhythmic thud of American artillery, a relentless drumbeat signaling the end of an empire. Among the shadows move the Japanese nurses, their faces gaunt masks of exhaustion and terror. They move with a ghostly precision, their hands trembling as they apply the last of the clean bandages. 4 months, they have lived on the edge of the world, pushed back by an unstoppable tide. Their reality is one of scarcity of medicine, scarcity of food, and most acutely, a scarcity of hope. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, feels like the approach of the demons they were warned about in every pamphlet and radio broadcast from Tokyo. To these women, the Americans are not merely soldiers. They are a subhuman force of destruction, a barbarian's horde that knows nothing of mercy and delights only in the desecration of the fallen. The sensory world of the hospital is closing in. The smell of antiseptic is long gone, replaced by the earthy stench of the damp ground and the pervasive odor of gangrene. The nurses work in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the inevitable moment when the perimeter falls. They have been told to expect the worst, that the Americans will show no quarter, that capture is a fate far more gruesome than the ritual suicide they have been prepared to commit. The symbolic weight of their mission, to care for the Emperor's warriors, is now a heavy stone in their chests. They are the daughters of a martial culture, bound by a code of silence and sacrifice, yet as the American shells creep closer, the raw human instinct to survive flickers desperately against the suffocating weight of their indoctrination. Outside, the jungle screams with the sounds of nocturnal predators and the unnatural cacophony of war. Inside, the nurses exchange glances that communicate everything their tongues are forbidden to speak. They are trapped between the steel-bound loyalty of their past and the terrifying uncertainty of a future that seems to hold only fire and shadow. The very ground beneath them vibrates with the power of an industrial giant they cannot see but can certainly feel. The monsters are no longer a distant threat. They are a physical presence in the air, a vibration in the marrow of their bones. The cinematic stillness of the hospital is the eye of a hurricane, a final moment of agonizing anticipation before the world they know is torn asunder by the arrival of an enemy they have been taught to hate, but whom they are about to see in a light that will shatter every pillar of their perceived reality. To understand the tears shed by these women, one must look back at the rigid societal structure that birthed them. The Japanese nursing corps of the 1940s was not merely a medical organization. It was an extension of the imperial cult of personality. These women, many from traditional families, were indoctrinated from childhood with the Bushido code, repurposed for a modern industrial war. They were taught that the ultimate grace lay in absolute subservience to the emperor, and that their role as angels of the battlefield was to ensure that no soldier's spirit wavered before his inevitable sacrifice. Education in the Japanese Empire during this era was a funnel, stripping away individual identity to forge a collective weapon of morale. By the time the war reached the Philippines, this indoctrination had been sharpened into a weapon of psychological terror. State propaganda depicted Americans as Kichiku Bei, devilish Americans and British. The narrative was consistent and terrifying. The enemy was a soulless beast that raped, tortured, and mutilated prisoners. To surrender was not just a disgrace to one's lineage, it was a descent into a literal hell. The Japanese nurses were told that American soldiers used the bones of fallen Japanese troops as jewelry, and that their medical units were fronts for human experimentation. This historical context created a psychological landscape where the sound of an American engine or the sight of an American uniform triggered a visceral, existential dread. The nurses were also victims of a profound logistical collapse. As the American island-hopping campaign accelerated, Japanese supply lines were severed, leaving these women to care for hundreds of wounded with nothing more than paper bandages and rusted instruments. They saw firsthand the physical cost of the emperor's ambitions, yet they remained locked in a cycle of devotion and fear. They were part of a system that prioritized spiritual fortitude over material reality, a philosophy that would soon collide with the American doctrine of overwhelming abundance and industrial might. This clash of ideologies was not just happening on the high seas or in the air. It was manifesting in the hearts of young women who were being prepared for a mass suicide that they believed was their only escape from the coming monsters. The gravity of this historical moment rests on this absolute polarization, a world built on the beauty of death meeting a world built on the chaotic, loud, and abundant promise of life. The moment of contact arrived not with a scream, but with the earth-shaking rumble of Sherman tanks and the sharp, rhythmic snap of Garand rifles. As the American perimeter closed in around the Leyte Field Hospital, the Japanese nurses clutched their small personal belongings, many holding hidden vials of potassium cyanide or short blades, prepared to enact the final Gyokusai, the shattered jewel, rather than face the imagined depravity of the U.S. infantry. They expected the doors to be kicked down by frenzied giants intent on slaughter. They anticipated the smell of gasoline and the searing heat of flamethrowers. Instead, the first Americans to enter were not the monsters of the propaganda posters, but dust-covered young men from places like Ohio and Nebraska, their eyes shielded by M1 helmets, their movements characterized by a strange, relaxed confidence that confounded the Japanese sense of rigid military decorum. The emotional contrast was immediate and jarring. Where the nurses expected the jagged edge of a bayonet, they found the sterile gleam of stainless steel. As they were rounded up and moved toward the American rear, they saw something that shook the very foundations of their indoctrination, the American Medical Corps in action. These demons did not execute the wounded Japanese soldiers left behind. Instead, they moved with a frantic professional urgency, applying sulfa powder and administering plasma from glass bottles that seemed to exist in endless supply. The nurses watched, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and lingering suspicion, as American corpsmen treated Japanese intestinal wounds with the same intensity they applied to their own. There was no ritualized cruelty, no triumphant mockery. There was only the cold, efficient machinery of Western medicine, fueled by an abundance of resources that the Japanese Empire could no longer even imagine. Historical evidence from the liberation of the Philippines confirms this pattern of cognitive dissonance. Captured medical staff recorded in their diaries the sheer disbelief at seeing American GIs sharing their rations, specifically the brightly colored tins of sea rations, with starving prisoners. The nurses, still trembling and awaiting a delayed execution, were instead led to a secure area where they were provided with clean water and white bread. The symbolism of the bread, soft, bleached, and plentiful, stood in stark contrast to the moldy, rationed rice they had survived on for months. They were being treated not as subhuman enemies, but as human assets, a shift in status that felt like a betrayal of everything they had been told. The Americans did not speak to them with the harsh barks of the Kempeitai. They spoke in a language of gestures and a bizarre, easygoing kindness that felt more threatening than violence because it was so utterly incomprehensible to the conditioned mind. This was the first crack in the ideological wall, the realization that the enemy was not a beast, but a man possessing a wealth that extended beyond his weapons into the very way he handled his captives. By late October 1944, the transition from the frantic terror of the front lines to the organized stillness of the American prisoner enclosure felt like a descent into an alien civilization. The Japanese nurses were processed into a sprawling rear echelon camp, a city of olive-drab canvas that had materialized in the mud of Leyte with impossible speed. Here, the historical evidence of American industrial might was no longer a theoretical threat, it was a physical environment. The nurses observed the constant flow of GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, the stacks of wooden crates reaching toward the palms, and the ubiquitous presence of the jeep. To a group of women who had seen their own army reduced to scavenging for roots, this display of logistical excess was a psychological blow. They were surrounded by a culture of more fuel, more ammunition, more medicine, and more food than their entire division had seen in a year. Within the wire of the enclosure, the nurses began to notice a recurring phenomenon that would become the central symbol of their captivity: the sound of organized American life. It was not the sound of barked orders or the mechanical clatter of the motor pool, but a melodic human abundance. Even in the heat of the Philippines, the American GIs seemed to possess a surplus of spirit. They whistled while they worked. They hummed tunes from a distant home while cleaning their rifles. This constant, casual use of music was a jarring contrast to the silence of the Japanese ranks, where sound was strictly regulated by military necessity. To the nurses, who had been taught that Americans were soulless machines of war, this auditory landscape suggested a depth of character they were not prepared to process. The camp was a microcosm of a democracy in motion, a place where the individual's voice was not suppressed but celebrated through small, everyday actions. The nurses watched from their designated tents as soldiers gathered in small groups during their limited downtime. They saw the exchange of mail, thousands of letters from a home front that seemed to care for every individual soldier. This was the abundance of connection, a stark departure from the shattered jewel philosophy that demanded the erasure of the self for the state. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp did not fall into a fearful, blackout-enforced hush. Instead, it hummed with the low, steady vibration of a society that remained human even in the heart of a global slaughter. The nurses sat in the twilight, their ears attuned to these foreign rhythms, beginning to realize that the monsters possessed something far more powerful than their tanks. They possessed a sense of joy that remained unbroken by the horrors of the Pacific. As the humid October twilight deepened into a thick, tropical velvet, a specific evening arrived that would forever alter the internal landscape of the captured medical staff. The American soldiers, having secured the immediate sector, began to congregate in the center of the muddy encampment. There was no barked command for assembly, no rigid formation dictated by a cold hierarchy. Instead, the men moved with a natural collective pull toward a makeshift clearing near the supply tents. The Japanese nurses, huddled at the edge of their designated area, watched with a mixture of suspicion and a lingering, bone-deep dread. Their ideology had prepared them for a display of victor's arrogance, perhaps a drunken celebration or a crude mockery of their defeated status, but the scene unfolding before them defied every pre-recorded expectation. The American soldiers sat on upturned crates and the tailgates of their idling trucks, their weary frames silhouetted against the dim glow of the camp's lanterns. In the shadows of the palms, the nurses remained invisible, their eyes wide as they witnessed a vulnerability they had been taught was a sign of Western decadence and weakness. These men, who only hours before had been the faceless engines of a massive military machine, were now stripping away their martial layers. They were sharing tobacco, leaning into one another's space with an easy familiarity, and speaking in low, murmuring tones that lacked the harsh, staccato rhythm of Japanese military discourse. To the nurses, this display of casual humanity was a profound contradiction. How could the demons of the propaganda posters possess such quiet, reflective grace? The atmosphere in the camp shifted from the mechanical noise of war to a heavy, expectant stillness. The soldiers were not reaching for weapons or celebrating a kill. They were reaching for a connection to a world that existed far beyond the reach of the jungle's rot. The nurses, still gripped by the residue of a fearful ideology, sensed a change in the air, a softening of the aggressive energy that usually defined an occupying force. They watched as a few soldiers pulled small, worn books from their breast pockets, their thumbs tracing the edges of the pages with a reverence usually reserved for the emperor's portrait. This was the abundance of the spirit, a wealth that did not depend on the caliber of a shell or the speed of a plane. In that moment of quiet observation, the nurses began to see the Americans not as an invading horde, but as a community of individuals who carried their home within them, a home built on a foundation of shared peace that the Japanese women had never been permitted to imagine. The first note did not rise from a command, but from a single clear throat somewhere near the center of the American gathering. It was a lonely, melodic thread that snagged on the heavy, humid air of the Leyte night, soon joined by a second voice, then a dozen, then 100. The Japanese nurses, crouched in the shadows of their canvas structures, stiffened as the collective sound swelled into the opening bars of "Abide with Me." This was not the brassy, aggressive blare of a military march or the frantic, high-pitched patriotic anthems they were accustomed to in the home islands. This was a deep, choral resonance, a slow-moving wave of harmony that seemed to smooth over the jagged edges of the war-torn landscape. The nurses listened, paralyzed by the sheer acoustic weight of the moment. In the Japanese military tradition, music was a tool of the state, designed to steel the nerves for death or to celebrate the expansion of the empire. It was sharp, percussive, and demanding. What they heard now was the opposite, a song of surrender, not to an earthly enemy, but to a divine peace. The voices of the American GIs, rough and unpolished from weeks of combat, carried a profound sincerity that transcended the language barrier. The melody possessed a structural beauty, a balance of major and minor keys, that suggested a civilization built on something more enduring than steel and gunpowder. The nurses, who had been taught that Americans were a disorganized rabble of individualists, were confronted with a harmony so unified it felt like a single massive heartbeat. The historical impact of this auditory shift cannot be overstated. As the soldiers moved into the old rugged cross, the nurses began to recognize the cadence of prayer. This was the abundance of faith, a resource that the imperial propaganda machine had never accounted for. The sound filled the vacuum of the jungle, pushing back the oppressive chirping of insects and the distant mechanical thud of the front lines. To the Japanese women, the music represented a terrifyingly beautiful contradiction. These men, capable of unleashing the fire of the Sherman tanks and the roar of the corsairs, were now singing of a crown for a cross with tears in their voices. The symbolic sound of the hymn became a bridge across an impossible divide, revealing a shared human longing for grace that the nurses had suppressed under years of martial law. The silence of the camp was no longer a void of fear. It had been filled by a spiritual architecture that made their own world of shattered jewels feel suddenly, devastatingly hollow. The tears began as a silent, physical betrayal of their training. As the rich, resonant chords of the American voices rose into the humid canopy, the Japanese nurses felt the rigid architecture of their world begin to crumble. These women had been forged in a furnace of stoicism, taught that to show emotion was to dishonor the emperor and to reveal a fatal flaw in the Japanese spirit. Yet, as the hymns Amazing Grace and Rock of Ages filled the clearing, the sheer, unadorned beauty of the melody bypassed their intellectual defenses. It was an emotional breakdown that was not rooted in fear, but in a devastating realization of shared humanity. The monsters were not howling for blood. They were singing of a grace that was sweet and precious. The transformation was visible in the way the nurses' posture changed. The defensive, huddled positions gave way to a hesitant, forward-leaning curiosity. To hear the enemy, men who had just come from the smoke and thunder of the front, offering up such delicate spiritual harmonies was a psychological shock that dismantled years of imperial indoctrination in a matter of minutes. The nurses realized that the Americans possessed a capacity for peace that was not a sign of weakness, but a reservoir of strength. The ideology of the shattered jewel, which demanded a beautiful death, suddenly seemed hollow when compared to this American abundance of life and spirit. The tears were a mourning for the lie they had lived and a baptism into a new, terrifyingly complex reality. Historical records from the aftermath of the Philippines campaign describe this specific phenomenon, the profound disorientation of Japanese prisoners when confronted with American religious and cultural expressions. For the nurses, the hymns served as a linguistic bridge. They did not need to understand the English lyrics to feel the weight of the devotion behind them. The sound of the singing acted as a solvent, dissolving the demon mask the propaganda had placed on the American soldier. They looked at their captors and saw not the architects of their destruction, but young men who were as displaced and weary as themselves, yet who possessed a spiritual anchor that allowed them to sing in the dark. This realization shifted their perception of the war from a racial and existential struggle to a tragic human catastrophe, one where the enemy held the very compassion they had been told was extinct in the West. The transformation was total. The fear of execution was replaced by a profound, weeping recognition of a brotherhood they had been forbidden to acknowledge. In the following days, the rigid divide between the captors and the captives began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative, quiet cooperation that defined the atmosphere of the Leyte medical station. The historical records of the transition highlight a remarkable shift in behavior. The Japanese nurses, once immobilized by the expectation of death, began to offer their expertise alongside American surgeons. They moved through the wards, no longer as prisoners awaiting a dark fate, but as medical professionals rediscovered. They saw American doctors treating Japanese prisoners with the same precious supplies, morphine, clean gauze, and sulfa, that they gave to their own boys from the Midwest. This parody of care was a revelation, a practical application of the democratic abundance they had heard in the hymns. The interaction was often wordless, governed by the universal language of healing. A nurse would hold a basin while a corpseman cleaned a wound. A Japanese medic would assist in the stabilization of a fractured limb. In these moments, the demon was replaced by a colleague. The nurses observed the Americans' behavior with a keen, analytical eye, noting the lack of the brutal corporal punishment that was standard in the Imperial Army. When an American private spoke out of turn or shared a joke with an officer, there was no slap to the face, no ritualized shaming. This absence of fear-based discipline was, to the nurses, as shocking as the presence of the hymns. It suggested a society that functioned not through the crushing of the individual, but through a chaotic, yet functioning, mutual respect. This period of the campaign saw the nurses fully integrating into the rhythm of the American unit. They shared the same K-rations, marveling at the abundance of chocolate and canned meats that were treated as standard issue rather than rare luxuries. The symbolic power of this material wealth was reinforced by the continued presence of music in the camp. The soldiers did not stop singing. The hymns remained a constant evening ritual, a spiritual tether that kept the men grounded. For the nurses, participating in the care of the wounded while surrounded by the sounds of the old rugged cross became a transformative experience. They were witnessing the dismantling of a lie, seeing firsthand that the strength of the West lay not in a desire for destruction, but in a culture that valued the sanctity of life and the restorative power of mercy. The shift in ideology was not a sudden snapping of a cord, but a slow, rhythmic erosion caused by the persistent tide of American benevolence. For the Japanese nurses, the internal collapse of the imperial mythos was finalized as they moved through the wards, witnessing the demons of their training acting as ministers of mercy. The historical transformation was rooted in the realization that the power of the United States was not merely industrial, but fundamentally moral. They saw that the American soldier fought with a ferocity born of a desire to return to a home defined by the very peace they sang about each evening. The hymns, once a foreign and terrifying sound, had become a psychological sanctuary, a sonic representation of a world where the individual was not a disposable cog in a war machine, but a soul worthy of song. This period of the campaign saw the nurses fully rejecting the shattered jewel philosophy. They no longer looked at their small blades or hidden poisons with a sense of duty, but with a growing horror at the waste they had once considered honorable. The abundance of the American spirit, manifested in the sharing of chocolate, the careful bandaging of an enemy's limb, and the collective rising of voices in prayer, had provided a mirror in which the nurses saw the reflection of their own suppressed humanity. They began to understand that democracy was not the chaotic weakness they had been taught to despise. It was a resilient, noisy, and deeply compassionate force that allowed for the coexistence of the warrior and the worshipper. The perception of the enemy had been completely inverted. The Americans were no longer the Kichiku Bay of the propaganda posters, but the architects of a new reality. The nurses' journals and later accounts reflect a profound sense of liberation, not just from the physical confines of the camp, but from the mental prison of the Shinto nationalist state. The sound of the hymns had served as the ultimate evidence of a civilization that valued life over a beautiful death. By the time the front line shifted further away, the nurses were no longer captives of a foreign power. They were witnesses to a truth that transcended the war, finding in the music of their captors a roadmap back to their own souls and a future that promised something more than fire and ash. The final notes of the American hymns did not simply vanish into the Philippine night. They lingered in the silence that followed, a poetic reflection of a world reborn from the ashes of a terminal ideology. To the Japanese nurses, the music was a bridge between the crushing weight of a shattered jeweled death and the vibrant, messy abundance of a democratic life. They had arrived at the edge of the world expecting the jagged cruelty of monsters, but instead they found the melodic grace of men who carried their homes in their hearts. The sound of Amazing Grace had achieved what no bombardment could. It had dismantled the high walls of state-sponsored hatred and replaced them with the simple, devastatingly beautiful truth of a shared human soul. This transformation was the ultimate victory of the American spirit, an abundance not of steel or oil, but of an unshakable belief in the sanctity of the individual. The nurses' tears were not a sign of defeat, but a baptism of freedom, marking the moment they realized that the enemy possessed the very peace they had been forbidden to seek. As the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, the memory of those nighttime choirs remained a steady light in the darkness of the Pacific. It was a reminder that even in the most brutal of conflicts, the human voice, when raised in harmony rather than a war cry, has the power to dissolve the borders of the mind and the chains of a false god. In the end, the story of the Japanese nurses and the singing GIs serves as a testament to the enduring power of mercy over martial pride. It reveals that the truest form of abundance is found in the capacity to see a brother in a captive and a neighbor in a foe. The hymns became a recurring symbol of a civilization that, despite its flaws and the horrors of the front, refused to surrender its humanity. As the tropical sun rose over a quieted Leyte, it shone on a group of women who no longer looked toward Tokyo for their identity, but toward a future where the only songs worth singing were those that celebrated the quiet, profound miracle of being alive and being free.